On November 17, 1944, at 0347 hours local time, the Japanese Convoy Tama-02 adjusted its heading by exactly 2.3 degrees northeast of its intended course. The correction, a minor recalibration that should have been routine, invisible, forgotten, instead became the fulcrum upon which an entire technological paradigm would eventually turn. This was not the dramatic pivot of a single decisive battle, nor the spectacular failure of some grand strategic gambit, but rather the quiet accumulation of systemic inadequacy, made suddenly catastrophically visible in the grey waters of the Philippine Sea. Within that seemingly insignificant angular deviation lay compressed the entire trajectory of Japan's technological future, a future that would emerge paradoxically from the precise measurement of its wartime failures. The mathematics were unforgiving. 2.3 degrees over 40 nautical miles translated to a positional error of approximately 1.6 miles, sufficient to transform a carefully planned evasion route into an execution ground. But mathematics, as Japan's post-war engineers would learn with methodical precision, could cut both ways. The error itself was unremarkable. Navigation mistakes happened daily across the Pacific theater, small course corrections absorbed into the larger chaos of a war that had already stretched Japanese logistics beyond any reasonable breaking point. Convoy commanders had learned to expect such deviations, to incorporate them into their tactical calculations, as inevitable friction in the machinery of maritime warfare. What made this particular miscalculation historically significant was not its magnitude but its timing, its location, and most crucially, the relentless precision with which American submarines had learned to exploit such vulnerabilities. The convoy's deviation placed it directly into the patrol zone of USS Flasher, whose sonar operator had been tracking acoustic anomalies in that precise grid square for the previous 72 hours. Petty Officer Second Class Robert Chen, hunched over his acoustic display in the submarine's forward compartment, had been listening to the ocean's electronic whispers with the concentrated attention of a physician monitoring a patient's heartbeat. His equipment, representing the cutting edge of American naval technology, could distinguish between the mechanical signatures of different vessel types, track multiple contacts simultaneously, and provide firing solutions with an accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. Chen understood, with the clarity that comes from technical mastery, that he was participating in more than tactical engagement. He was demonstrating the future of warfare itself, a future where information superiority would prove more decisive than courage, where mathematical precision would triumph over seamanship, and where the ability to see clearly through darkness would determine the difference between survival and annihilation. The acoustic waves propagating through the Philippine Sea carried more than navigational data. They carried the seeds of a technological revolution that would eventually transform both victor and vanquished. By late 1944, Japan's merchant marine existed in a state of controlled catastrophe, a logistical organism whose circulatory system was hemorrhaging at a rate that no amount of tactical innovation could staunch. The combined fleet's early victories had created an empire spanning nearly 1/6 of the globe's surface, but sustaining such territorial enormity required logistical arteries that Japanese industrial capacity had never been designed to support. Every convoy route had become a calculated gamble against American submarine warfare, which had evolved from the clumsy, torpedo-plagued campaigns of 1942 into a systematic dismantling of Japanese maritime commerce. The transformation of American naval technology during these crucial years represented more than incremental improvement. It constituted a paradigmatic shift in the fundamental nature of maritime warfare, where Japanese naval doctrine remained rooted in concepts of honor, seamanship, and individual heroism, philosophical constructs that had served adequately during the age of visual combat. American naval strategy had embraced a different set of principles entirely. Their approach prioritized systematic information gathering, mathematical modeling of enemy behavior, and the integration of multiple sensor systems into coherent tactical pictures. This philosophical divergence manifested most clearly in the realm of acoustic technology. Japanese hydrophone operators, working with equipment that differed only marginally from devices used during World War I, were expected to interpret underwater sounds through experience and intuition. They listened for the distinctive mechanical signatures of different vessel types, learned to distinguish between friend and foe based on propeller characteristics, and developed an almost mystical sensitivity to the acoustic environment of their operational areas. Their skills were genuine and often remarkable, but they were fundamentally human skills, subject to fatigue, distraction, and the inherent limitations of biological sensory processing. American sonar operators, by contrast, worked within an entirely different technological framework. Their equipment incorporated mathematical filtering algorithms that could separate meaningful signals from background noise, automatic tracking systems that maintained contact with multiple targets simultaneously, and integrated fire control computers that could calculate torpedo intercept courses faster and more accurately than any human navigator. The difference was not merely one of degree, but of kind. Japanese sailors were fighting with enhanced human capabilities, while their American counterparts were fighting with augmented machine capabilities. The technical reality was stark and unforgiving. Japanese convoy protection relied primarily on visual observation, basic hydrophones, and coordination protocols developed during the Russo-Japanese War 4 decades earlier. These methods had proven adequate against opponents operating within similar technological constraints, but they were catastrophically inadequate against an enemy whose sensor capabilities extended far beyond the range of human perception. American submarines could detect, classify, and track Japanese surface vessels from distances that rendered traditional escort tactics meaningless. The mathematical precision of this technological asymmetry was demonstrated daily in the statistical reports that flowed into Imperial Navy headquarters. Convoy loss rates had climbed from less than 5% in early 1942 to more than 30% by late 1944, a rate of attrition that was not merely unsustainable but mathematically guaranteed to result in total strategic collapse within months. Japanese naval planners, trained in the traditions of decisive battle and honorable defeat, found themselves confronting an enemy whose approach to warfare was fundamentally actuarial. Tama-02 represented both the desperation and the determination of this period. The convoy carried 14,000 tons of strategic materials, rubber, tin, oil, rice, extracted from the Dutch East Indies and bound for the industrial centers of Honshu. Each ton represented not merely economic value but existential necessity. Without these raw materials, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt within weeks. The convoy's cargo manifest read like an inventory of industrial civilization itself: lubricants for aircraft engines, rubber for vehicle tires, metals for ammunition production, food for a population already reduced to subsistence rations. Its escort consisted of 2 destroyers, Shikinami and Uranami, veteran warships whose crews understood that their primary mission was not victory but delay, to absorb enough punishment that some portion of their charges might reach port. The ships themselves embodied Japan's technological predicament, vessels designed for surface combat in an era when the decisive engagements occurred underwater, armed with weapons systems optimized for battles that no longer happened, crewed by sailors whose training emphasized courage over technical competence. The mathematics of attrition had become brutally simple and absolutely decisive. Japan needed these materials to continue fighting. America needed to sink the ships carrying them. Everything else was tactical detail, individual heroism rendered meaningless by systemic technological inadequacy. The men aboard Shikinami and Uranami were not inferior sailors. Many were veterans of multiple convoy runs, survivors whose skills had been honed by months of combat against increasingly sophisticated opposition. But skill, as they had learned through bitter experience, was no match for technology that could see through darkness, track through interference, and strike with mechanical precision. The navigation error that would define Tama-02's fate originated not from individual incompetence, but from systemic degradation. The convoy's lead navigator, Lieutenant Commander Yoshida Kenji, was operating with charts 3 months out of date, celestial navigation equipment that had been jury-rigged twice since leaving Balikpapan, and magnetic compass readings compromised by the steel bulk of the ships around him. His calculations were performed under blackout conditions, using slide rules and mathematical tables, while enemy submarines maintained continuous sonar contact with technologies he could neither detect nor comprehend. The specific sequence of mistakes that placed Tama-02 in mortal danger began with a seemingly minor atmospheric disturbance, the kind of meteorological interference that experienced navigators learned to expect and compensate for through decades of professional practice. At 0200 hours, heavy cloud cover obscured the stellar references that Lieutenant Commander Yoshida Kenji had been using for position fixing, forcing him to rely entirely on dead reckoning from the previous day's noon sight. This would have been manageable under normal circumstances, but the convoy had been maintaining radio silence for 36 hours, preventing any communication with shore-based navigation stations that might have provided updated bearings or warning of changed conditions. Yoshida was not incompetent, quite the contrary. His service record included successful convoy runs from Singapore to Yokohama, navigation assignments in the Coral Sea during the height of American air attacks, and commendations for seamanship under fire that marked him as one of the Navy's most capable convoy commanders. But competence, as he had learned through bitter experience, was increasingly irrelevant in a war where technological superiority had replaced tactical skill as the primary determinant of survival. His navigational tools, sextant, chronometer, magnetic compass, and paper charts were the same instruments that had served Japanese navigators for generations, refined through decades of maritime tradition, but fundamentally unchanged since the era of sailing ships. The mathematical precision required for accurate celestial navigation demanded not merely skill but optimal conditions, clear skies for stellar observation, accurate timekeeping for longitude determination, and most critically, charts that reflected current oceanographic conditions. Yoshida possessed the first two requirements in abundance, but the third had become increasingly elusive as the war progressed, and Japanese hydrographic services fell behind the pace of combat operations. His calculations were methodical, and within their limitations, accurate. He accounted for current set and drift based on oceanographic data from 1941, information that had been reliable when first compiled, but had grown increasingly obsolete as American submarine operations altered shipping patterns and disturbed the traditional flow of maritime traffic. He compensated for magnetic variation using charts published in 1943, before the establishment of new Allied airfields had introduced additional magnetic interference into the region. He applied wind correction factors derived from surface observations and barometric pressure readings, measurements that were precise but limited to the convoy's immediate vicinity. Each individual computation was performed correctly, executed with the mathematical rigor that marked Yoshida as a competent professional navigator. But the cumulative effect of outdated information was a navigational solution that placed the convoy approximately 4.2 nautical miles northeast of its actual position, an error that existed not in Yoshida's calculations, but in the fundamental assumptions upon which those calculations were based. The error compounded when Yoshida attempted to correct for what he perceived as an eastward drift. His mathematical model of ocean currents, based on pre-war hydrographic surveys, suggested that the convoy had been pushed off course by prevailing flows that no longer existed in their predicted patterns. The course correction he ordered, 2.3 degrees to port, was intended to compensate for a deviation that existed only in his increasingly obsolete understanding of the Pacific Ocean's dynamic systems. Reality and theory had diverged, but Yoshida had no way of detecting the divergence until it was too late. The irony was profound and historically significant. Japanese navigation techniques, honed through centuries of maritime tradition, were being defeated not by superior seamanship but by superior information processing. The mathematical principles underlying celestial navigation remained valid, but the data required to apply those principles had become compromised by warfare's disruption of normal oceanographic patterns. Yoshida was fighting a battle between human skill and machine precision, individual competence against systematic technological advantage. Meanwhile, 200 feet below the surface and 15 miles to the northeast, USS Flasher was demonstrating the technological evolution that would soon reshape naval warfare entirely. The submarine's acoustic environment represented a convergence of scientific disciplines that had been unknown to naval architects just 5 years earlier. Sonar arrays incorporating dozens of individual transducers provided three-dimensional mapping of the underwater acoustic environment. Signal processing equipment based on mathematical algorithms developed at Bell Laboratories filtered meaningful contacts from background noise with mechanical precision. Fire control computers calculated intercept courses faster and more accurately than any human operator. The submarine's sonar operator, Petty Officer Second Class Robert Chen, was monitoring the convoy's approach using equipment that represented the cutting edge of American acoustic technology. His sonar array could detect and classify surface contacts at ranges exceeding 20 miles, distinguish between different ship types based on propeller signatures, and track multiple targets simultaneously with a precision that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The mathematical sophistication of his equipment was extraordinary. Fourier transforms separated acoustic signals into component frequencies, correlation algorithms identified specific vessel characteristics, and automated tracking systems maintained contact even when human operators were distracted or fatigued. Chen had been following the convoy since 100 hours, plotting its course and speed with mechanical regularity. His acoustic display showed the convoy as a cluster of discrete contacts, each vessel identified by its unique acoustic signature and tracked independently by automated systems that required minimal human intervention. When Tama-02 adjusted its heading at 0347, the change registered immediately on his display screens as a subtle shift in bearing rate and acoustic signature, a minor alteration that would have been invisible to Japanese observers but was precisely recorded by American sensor systems. The technological asymmetry was complete and decisive. Japanese lookouts, straining their eyes against the darkness, could observe only what lay within visual range, perhaps 10 miles under optimal conditions. American sonar operators, working with electronic senses that extended far beyond human perception, maintained contact with surface vessels from distances that rendered traditional escort tactics meaningless. The battle had been decided before it began, determined not by individual courage or tactical skill, but by the fundamental physics of acoustic wave propagation and the mathematical precision of electronic signal processing. The deviation was minor, barely perceptible to human observers on the surface, but it was moving the convoy directly into the attack zone that Flasher's captain had been preparing for the previous 4 hours. Captain George Grider, studying the tactical plot in the submarine's control room, could see the convergence developing with mathematical certainty. His fire control computers had already calculated multiple attack scenarios, and the convoy's course change was improving his firing solution with each passing minute. The engagement had become a problem in applied mathematics, with human lives as variables in an equation whose solution was predetermined by technological superiority. At most 452 hours, the two technological paradigms met with absolute finality, a collision between human skill and mechanical precision that would reverberate through decades of subsequent naval development. The convergence was not dramatic in the traditional sense. There were no visible explosions of flame, no thunderous exchanges of artillery fire, no desperate charges across contested ground. Instead, the decisive moment arrived with the quiet efficiency of a mathematical equation reaching its inevitable solution. Flasher's acoustic torpedoes, launched from a range of 1,800 yards, tracked their targets with inhuman precision through the dark water. Each weapon carried within its guidance system the accumulated knowledge of American acoustic engineering, mathematical algorithms that could distinguish between target signatures and background noise, homing devices that adjusted course automatically to maintain contact with moving vessels, and warheads designed to maximize damage through precise placement rather than overwhelming explosive force. The torpedoes were not merely weapons but demonstrations of applied science, underwater missiles that embodied years of research into fluid dynamics, signal processing, and mechanical engineering. The Japanese escort destroyers, operating with equipment that could neither detect the incoming weapons nor communicate effectively with their charges, were reduced to spectators at their own destruction. Shikanami's sonar operator, Petty Officer Tanaka Hiroshi, was listening intently through headphones connected to hydrophones that represented the pinnacle of Japanese acoustic technology, devices that were sophisticated by the standards of 1920, but primitive compared to the electronic systems tracking his convoy from below. Tanaka was a skilled operator, trained to recognize the acoustic signatures of different vessel types and to distinguish between natural ocean sounds and mechanical noise generated by enemy submarines. But his skills, however refined, were biological skills, subject to fatigue, limited by human sensory capabilities, and dependent upon interpretation rather than mechanical calculation. The American torpedoes approaching through the darkness operated according to different principles entirely. Their guidance systems incorporated feedback loops that continuously adjusted course based on acoustic input, mechanical brains that could process information faster and more accurately than any human operator. They were immune to fatigue, unaffected by fear, and capable of maintaining target contact even under conditions that would overwhelm human sensory systems. The approaching weapons represented the future of warfare, autonomous systems that required minimal human guidance and could operate effectively in environments where human capabilities were inadequate. The first torpedo struck the lead freighter Hokkai Maru amidships at 0452 hours and 37 seconds, rupturing its cargo holds and flooding its engine compartment within 90 seconds. The explosion was visible for 12 miles, a column of flame that briefly transformed night into day and announced to every submarine within sonar range that another convoy had died according to schedule. The mathematical precision of the impact was extraordinary. The torpedo had struck at precisely the point calculated to maximize structural damage its warhead detonating at the optimal depth to breach both the vessel's hull and its internal bulkheads simultaneously. Hokkai Maru's destruction was not merely tactical but symbolic. The ship had been carrying rubber stocks essential to Japanese aircraft production, tin ingots required for ammunition manufacturing, and lubricants that were irreplaceable given Japan's isolation from global petroleum markets. Each item lost represented not just economic value, but strategic capability. Materials that could not be replaced, resources that would be unavailable for months or years to come. The sinking was simultaneously a local tactical victory and a contribution to Japan's broader strategic collapse. The second torpedo found Yamashina Maru 40 seconds later, its warhead detonating directly beneath the ship's loaded fuel bunkers and creating a fireball that consumed the vessel entirely within minutes. The explosion was so intense that it briefly overwhelmed Flasher's sonar systems, the acoustic signature of destruction masking all other sounds in the immediate area. Yamashina Maru had been carrying aviation gasoline, fuel that Japan could ill afford to lose, and that had required months of careful transportation from refineries in the Dutch East Indies. The ship's destruction eliminated not merely current supplies but future operational capability, reducing Japanese air power through the simple expedient of denying it essential resources. Shikinami responded with depth charges, but her sonar operator was working with equipment that could barely distinguish between submarine contacts and underwater thermal layers. Tanaka dropped his hydrophones into the water and listened with desperate concentration, trying to locate the submarine that had just destroyed 2 of his charges. But Flasher was operating beyond the effective range of Japanese detection equipment, maneuvering in 3 dimensions while Japanese ships were limited to surface movement and indirect fire against targets they could not accurately locate. The pattern of explosions fell harmlessly around Flasher, which had already adjusted depth and bearing to avoid retaliation. Captain Grider, monitoring the attack from the submarine's control room, could track the depth charges through his sonar system with perfect clarity, each explosion registering as a brief acoustic spike that provided no threat to his vessel's safety. The American submarine's sonar continued tracking the remaining ships with clinical detachment, marking targets for additional attacks while Japanese sailors died in water temperatures that would kill them within 30 minutes. The technological asymmetry was complete and devastating. Japan's finest naval officers, operating with courage and professional competence that exceeded any reasonable standard, were helpless against an enemy whose sensors could see through darkness and whose weapons could navigate independently toward their targets. The convoy's destruction consumed exactly 18 minutes from first torpedo impact to the final sinking of Uranami, which had attempted to ram the submarine it could not locate and succeeded only in exposing itself to a spread of torpedoes that struck with mechanical inevitability. Uranami's final moments embodied the fundamental tragedy of Japan's naval war. Her captain, Commander Sasaki Noboru, was a veteran of surface actions in the Solomon Islands, a naval officer whose understanding of maritime warfare had been shaped by decades of training in tactics that emphasized close-range engagement and individual heroism. Sasaki had survived multiple convoy runs, demonstrated exceptional seamanship under fire, and earned the respect of his crew through competent leadership during increasingly desperate circumstances. But competence and courage were insufficient against an enemy whose weapons operated beyond the range of human perception, and whose targeting systems exceeded the accuracy of any human gunner. Sasaki's attempt to ram Flasher was tactically sound according to the principles of surface warfare that had governed naval combat for centuries. Ramming was a last resort, but it was a last resort that had proven effective against submarines operating at periscope depth within visual range. The tactic required precise navigation, careful timing, and the kind of seamanship that Japanese naval officers had mastered through years of professional training. But Flasher was not operating at periscope depth, was not within visual range, and was maneuvering according to information provided by sonar systems that exceeded human sensory capabilities. The American submarine's torpedoes struck Uranami, while Sasaki was still searching for his target, the weapons homing on the destroyer's acoustic signature, while its crew remained unaware of their approach. The final explosion was visible from Flasher's periscope, a brief flare of light that marked the end of another Japanese warship and the completion of another successful patrol. For the American crew, the engagement had been routine, almost mechanical. Locate targets, calculate firing solutions, launch weapons, confirm results. The human drama of Japanese sailors fighting for their lives was invisible beneath the statistical reality of convoy destruction. Lieutenant Commander Yoshida survived the sinking of his flagship, clinging to debris in the oil-slicked water, while Flasher disappeared into the depths to hunt additional targets. His navigation error 2.3 degrees over a distance of 40 nautical miles had delivered his convoy into an execution ground from which no amount of seamanship or courage could provide escape. The mathematics were irrefutable. The technology was decisive. The outcome was predetermined by forces that exceeded human agency. As Yoshida floated in the darkness, surrounded by the debris of ships that had carried Japan's industrial lifeblood, he was witnessing more than tactical defeat. He was observing the end of an era in which human skill and individual heroism could determine the outcome of military engagements. The future belonged to nations that could integrate mathematical precision with mechanical capability, that could see clearly through darkness and strike accurately across distances that rendered traditional naval tactics obsolete. Japan had lost more than ships and cargo. It had encountered a form of warfare that its military tradition was fundamentally unprepared to comprehend. In the aftermath of Tama-02's destruction, as rescue vessels collected the scattered survivors and American intelligence analysts processed the latest confirmation of their submarine warfare's effectiveness, a different kind of reckoning was beginning in the technical bureaus of Japan's military establishment. The convoy's loss was statistically insignificant, one more data point in a curve that had been trending toward inevitable defeat for months. American submarine commanders filed routine after-action reports, their accounts notable only for their mechanical precision and complete absence of dramatic detail. But for a small group of Japanese naval engineers and communications specialists, the specific manner of Tama-02's destruction represented something more troubling than tactical failure. The recognition came gradually, filtering through official reports and survivor testimonies like a slow chemical reaction that transforms ordinary materials into something entirely different. Commander Nakajima Tadashi, analyzing after-action reports in the cramped offices of the Naval Technical Research Institute, understood that his nation's defeat was not merely a question of industrial capacity or strategic resources. The fundamental architecture of maritime warfare had shifted beneath Japan's feet, and its military establishment had failed to recognize the transition until far too late. This realization demanded intellectual honesty of a kind that military institutions rarely cultivate. Nakajima was forced to acknowledge that his own technical education, rooted in mechanical engineering principles that had served adequately for decades, was fundamentally inadequate for understanding the electronic warfare that was destroying Japanese naval power. The mathematics underlying American sonar technology were not merely advanced versions of familiar concepts, but represented entirely different approaches to the problems of detection, tracking, and targeting. American submarines were not simply better equipped than their Japanese counterparts, they were operating within an entirely different technological paradigm, one that rendered traditional naval tactics obsolete. The acoustic sensors that had made Tama-02's destruction possible represented the convergence of multiple scientific disciplines that Japanese technical education had treated as separate fields of study: electronics, mathematics, mechanical engineering, and applied physics. American naval technology had achieved systematic integration while Japanese technology remained compartmentalized, organized according to administrative convenience rather than operational effectiveness. The recognition was professionally devastating and intellectually liberating. Nakajima and his colleagues could see with crystalline clarity that Japan's post-war survival would require not just reconstruction but technological revolution. The sensor technologies that had made Tama-02's destruction possible, sonar arrays, acoustic processing systems, integrated fire control networks, represented the future of both military and civilian applications. Understanding them, improving upon them, and eventually surpassing them would become a matter of national necessity. But understanding American technology would require more than simple reverse engineering. Japanese engineers would need to reconstruct not merely the mechanical artifacts, but the intellectual frameworks that had made such devices possible. They would need to learn new forms of mathematics, develop different approaches to systems integration, and most challenging of all, reorganize their institutional structures to support sustained technological innovation rather than incremental improvement of existing designs. This moment of clarity, born from catastrophic military failure, would eventually grow into something unprecedented in Japanese technological development, a systematic government-sponsored program to reverse engineer and then transcend the technologies that had defeated their navy. The program would begin modestly, with captured American equipment and technical personnel recruited from submarine crews, but its ambitions extended far beyond simple imitation. The ethical dimension of this technological transformation was complex and historically significant. Japanese engineers studying American sensor technology were not merely learning to build better weapons, they were discovering principles that could be applied to civilian problems with humanitarian benefits. The same mathematical algorithms that enabled submarine sonar could be adapted for medical diagnosis, industrial quality control, and environmental monitoring. Military defeat was creating opportunities for civilian progress, but only for those with sufficient intellectual flexibility to recognize the connections. Nakajima understood that he was participating in more than technical analysis. He was helping to chart Japan's path from military defeat to technological renaissance, from imperial ambition to peaceful prosperity. The acoustic sensors that had destroyed Tama-02 would eventually enable ultrasound medical imaging, precision manufacturing, and countless other applications that would improve human welfare rather than destroy it. But this transformation would require sustained intellectual effort, institutional support, and most critically, the moral commitment to apply technological capability for constructive rather than destructive purposes. The weight of this responsibility was both inspiring and sobering. Japanese engineers who had spent the war years developing weapons now had the opportunity to develop technologies that could heal rather than harm, build rather than destroy, connect rather than isolate. The choice was not predetermined. Technological capability could be applied for good or ill, depending upon the wisdom and moral character of those who controlled it. The same acoustic principles that enabled submarine warfare could enable medical diagnosis, but only if Japanese society committed itself to peaceful rather than military applications. This reflection reveals the deeper moral architecture underlying technological competition. Innovation is never morally neutral. It embodies the values and priorities of the societies that create it. American sensor technology had been developed primarily for military applications, but its mathematical foundations were applicable to countless civilian purposes. Japanese engineers studying this technology had the opportunity to emphasize those civilian applications, to demonstrate that former enemies could transform instruments of war into tools of peace and prosperity. The historical significance of this moment extends beyond the specific technologies involved. Nakajima and his colleagues were discovering that intellectual humility, the willingness to acknowledge technological inferiority and learn from former enemies, could become a source of competitive advantage. Nations that could study their defeats systematically, extract useful principles from their failures, and apply those principles to new challenges would ultimately prove more adaptable than nations that relied solely upon their existing technological superiority. The transformation that followed Japan's surrender was both systematic and revolutionary, but it began in the most mundane circumstances imaginable. Cluttered laboratory spaces in bombed-out university buildings, where teams of engineers worked with salvaged equipment and improvised tools to understand technologies that had defeated their nation. In the rubble of Tokyo and Yokohama, former military engineers who had spent the war years developing obsolete torpedo guidance systems began dismantling American sonar equipment with the methodical precision of surgeons studying anatomy. They were not simply trying to understand how these devices functioned, but rather why they had been designed according to particular principles, and how those principles might be extended into entirely new applications. The physical environment was harsh and demoralizing. Laboratories lacked adequate heating, reliable electrical power, and basic scientific instruments. Engineers worked in winter coats using flashlights when grid power failed, measuring electronic components with equipment that had been damaged during bombing raids and repaired with whatever materials could be scavenged from military stockpiles. But the intellectual environment was extraordinary, a concentration of technical talent that had been freed from military constraints and redirected toward civilian applications. Nakajima, promoted to head the newly formed Acoustic Research Division, approached the challenge with the intellectual rigor of a physicist and the practical urgency of a survivor. His teams began by mapping the electronic architectures of captured American sensors, identifying the mathematical relationships between signal processing algorithms and acoustic detection capabilities. They learned to think in terms of frequency domains and signal-to-noise ratios, concepts that had been peripheral to pre-war Japanese naval technology but were obviously central to the emerging science of electronic warfare. The mathematical sophistication required was extraordinary. American sonar systems incorporated Fourier transforms for frequency analysis, correlation algorithms for pattern recognition, and feedback control systems that adjusted performance automatically based on environmental conditions. Japanese engineers had to master not merely the mechanical construction of these devices, but the theoretical frameworks that made their operation possible. They studied mathematics textbooks in English, learned to read technical specifications written in unfamiliar notation, and gradually developed the conceptual vocabulary required to understand electronic systems design. The breakthrough came not from simple reverse engineering, but from recognizing that acoustic sensing technology could be abstracted beyond its military origins. The same mathematical principles that allowed submarines to track surface vessels could be applied to industrial quality control, medical diagnosis, geological surveying, and eventually, the manufacturing processes that would define Japan's economic resurrection. The physics of wave propagation remained constant, only the applications were different. This insight was simultaneously technical and philosophical. Japanese engineers discovered that American technological superiority was not based on secret knowledge or proprietary techniques, but on systematic application of well-understood scientific principles. The acoustic sensors that had destroyed Tama-02 incorporated the same physical laws that governed all wave phenomena, from sound propagation through water to electromagnetic radiation through space. The principles were universal. The challenge was learning to apply them creatively to new problems. Sonar became ultrasound, acoustic tracking became precision measurement, military defeat became technological opportunity. The transformation was not dramatic but gradual, accomplished through thousands of small innovations that cumulated into systematic technological advancement. Japanese engineers learned to miniaturize American sensor designs, reduce their power consumption, and adapt them for civilian applications that American developers had never considered. By 1950, Japan's emerging electronics industry was producing acoustic sensors that matched American military specifications. The devices were mechanically simple but mathematically sophisticated, incorporating signal processing algorithms that could extract meaningful information from noisy environments with remarkable precision. Japanese manufacturers had learned to combine wartime miniaturization techniques with acoustic principles extracted from their former enemies, creating products that were smaller, more efficient, and often more reliable than their American predecessors. By 1955, they were manufacturing devices that exceeded those specifications while consuming less power and occupying smaller physical footprints. The technological advantage that had made Tama-02's destruction inevitable was not only neutralized but reversed, as Japanese engineers learned to combine miniaturization techniques developed during the war with acoustic principles extracted from their former enemies. The same mathematical algorithms that had enabled American submarine sonar were being applied to industrial applications that created civilian prosperity rather than military destruction. The institutional transformation was as significant as the technological development. Japanese companies that emerged from this systematic technological acquisition, Sony, Panasonic, and dozens of smaller specialized manufacturers, were not simply rebuilding Japan's industrial base, but creating entirely new categories of consumer and industrial products. These organizations were structured to support continuous innovation rather than incremental improvement, to integrate multiple technical disciplines rather than compartmentalize them, and to compete in global markets through technological advancement rather than protected domestic sales. Acoustic sensors became integral components of everything from medical equipment to automotive systems, transforming a military technology into a foundation for civilian prosperity. Ultrasound medical imaging enabled non-invasive diagnosis of internal conditions. Acoustic gauging systems improved manufacturing precision in industries ranging from steel production to semiconductor fabrication. Sonar-derived technologies enhanced automotive safety through collision avoidance systems that could detect obstacles in conditions where human vision was inadequate. The transformation was complete but never finished. Each application of acoustic sensor technology revealed new possibilities for further development, creating a virtuous cycle of innovation that expanded the market for sophisticated electronic devices while improving their performance and reducing their cost. Japanese companies that had learned to reverse engineer American military technology discovered that they could often improve upon the original designs by applying manufacturing techniques that emphasized quality, reliability, and cost-effectiveness rather than rapid deployment under wartime conditions. The companies that emerged from this systematic technological acquisition were not merely rebuilding Japan's industrial base, but creating entirely new categories of consumer and industrial products that had never existed before. They were demonstrating that former enemies could become technological partners, that military technologies could be transformed into civilian applications, and that systematic learning from defeat could become a foundation for subsequent prosperity. The trajectory from Tama-02's destruction to Japan's post-war sensor revolution illuminates a fundamental principle of technological competition that extends far beyond the specific circumstances of submarine warfare or acoustic engineering. Defeat often teaches more effectively than victory, but only for those with sufficient intellectual humility to learn from their failures systematically, rather than simply mourning their losses. American naval superiority in 1944 was absolute and decisive, but it was also temporary and ultimately self-defeating in ways that neither victor nor vanquished could anticipate during the immediate aftermath of combat. By demonstrating the possibilities of acoustic sensor technology so convincingly, American submarines inadvertently provided their former enemies with a detailed blueprint for technological advancement that would eventually surpass the original models in sophistication, efficiency, and commercial applicability. The lesson was profound but subtle. Technological superiority creates its own vulnerabilities by revealing the principles upon which that superiority is based. Victory demonstrates capability. Defeat motivates systematic learning. The moral architecture underlying this transformation deserves careful examination. The same acoustic technologies that enabled the destruction of Japanese convoys also enabled medical advances that saved countless lives, industrial improvements that enhanced safety and efficiency, and scientific developments that expanded human understanding of natural phenomena. The mathematics of wave propagation remained constant, but its applications shifted from destructive to constructive purposes, depending upon the moral framework within which the technology was developed and deployed. This transformation required both intellectual humility and engineering precision. The willingness to acknowledge technological inferiority, combined with the methodical patience to reverse engineer superior systems, component by component, algorithm by algorithm, principle by principle. The process was neither dramatic nor heroic, but it was absolutely decisive in reshaping the global balance of technological capability. Japanese engineers studying American sonar technology were learning more than circuit design and signal processing techniques. They were discovering how sustained research and development could be organized to produce continuous technological advancement. The institutional implications were as significant as the technical developments. Japanese companies that emerged from this systematic technological acquisition learned to organize themselves around continuous innovation rather than incremental improvement, to integrate multiple technical disciplines rather than compartmentalize them, and to compete in global markets through technological advancement rather than protected domestic sales. They were discovering that systematic learning from technological defeat could become a competitive advantage that persisted long after the original military context had become historically irrelevant. The lesson extends beyond military technology into the broader dynamics of innovation and industrial development. Japan's post-war success in electronics manufacturing was not simply a matter of superior work ethic or government planning, but rather the result of systematic learning from technological defeat that was organized around clear principles and sustained through institutional commitment. The sensor revolution that began in captured American sonar equipment eventually expanded into virtually every aspect of modern electronics, from the miniaturized components that made transistor radios possible to the precision manufacturing techniques that enabled the semiconductor industry. This expansion was not automatic or inevitable. It required deliberate choices about how to apply technological knowledge, sustained investment in research and development, and most critically, the moral commitment to use advanced technology for constructive rather than destructive purposes. The same mathematical principles that had enabled submarine warfare could be applied to medical diagnosis, industrial quality control, or environmental monitoring, but only if institutions existed to support such applications and markets existed to reward them. The engineers who studied American sonar technology in the late 1940s were learning more than circuit design and signal processing techniques. They were discovering how systematic research and development could be organized to produce continuous technological advancement, how military requirements could be translated into civilian applications, and how international technological competition could be transformed from zero-sum conflict into positive-sum innovation. The process required both technical competence and institutional wisdom, individual skill and organizational capability. The broader implications extend into contemporary discussions of technological competition and international relations. Nations that can study their defeats systematically, extract useful principles from their failures, and apply those principles to new challenges will ultimately prove more adaptable than nations that rely solely upon their existing technological superiority. Technological advantage is always temporary. The capability to learn and adapt is potentially permanent. This principle applies not merely to military technology, but to all forms of systematic innovation. Companies, institutions, and entire societies that can examine their failures honestly, identify the principles underlying their opponents' successes, and adapt those principles to their own circumstances will outperform competitors who mistake temporary advantages for permanent superiority. The acoustic sensors that destroyed Tama-02 represented American technological capability at a specific moment in history, but the principles underlying those sensors were universally applicable and could be improved upon by any organization with sufficient commitment to systematic learning. The moral dimension of this process cannot be ignored. Technological capability is morally neutral, but its application reflects the values and priorities of the institutions that control it. The same acoustic principles that enabled submarine warfare also enabled medical ultrasound, but the transition from military to civilian applications required conscious choices about how to invest research effort, organize institutional priorities, and allocate economic resources. Japan's post-war sensor revolution succeeded not merely because Japanese engineers were technically competent, but because Japanese society committed itself to applying technological capability for constructive rather than destructive purposes. The historical record demonstrates that technological competition, properly organized, can become a force for human progress rather than simply an extension of military conflict. Former enemies can become technological partners. Weapons technologies can be transformed into medical devices. Military defeat can become the foundation for civilian prosperity. But these transformations require institutional wisdom, moral commitment, and sustained effort over decades rather than immediate results. The story of Tama-02 thus becomes a parable about the relationship between technological capability and human wisdom. Advanced technology amplifies human intentions, whether constructive or destructive, but it does not determine those intentions. The choice between building weapons or healing devices, between military applications or civilian benefits, between zero-sum competition or positive-sum innovation, remains fundamentally human. Technology provides capability. Wisdom determines application. Today, in an era where acoustic sensors are embedded in devices so commonplace that their technological sophistication passes unnoticed, smartphones that respond to voice commands, automobiles that avoid collisions automatically, medical equipment that images internal organs without surgical intervention, the connection between Lieutenant Commander Yoshida's navigation error and the electronic infrastructure of modern civilization may seem tenuous, almost mystical in its complexity. But the chain of causation is direct and demonstrable, traceable through decades of systematic technological development that transformed the instruments of naval warfare into the foundation of peaceful prosperity. The acoustic technologies that allowed USS Flasher to track Tama-02 through the darkness of the Philippine Sea were systematically studied, improved, and miniaturized by Japanese engineers whose work eventually enabled everything from medical ultrasound imaging to automotive collision avoidance systems, from industrial quality control to environmental monitoring, from consumer electronics to space exploration. Each application built upon mathematical principles, first demonstrated in military contexts, but gradually extended into civilian domains through the patient accumulation of technical knowledge and institutional capability. The mathematics remain unchanged. Acoustic waves still propagate through materials according to the same physical laws that governed submarine warfare in 1944. Laws that describe the relationship between frequency and wavelength, the behavior of sound in different media, the mathematical techniques for extracting meaningful signals from noisy environments. But the applications have multiplied exponentially as engineers learned to apply military precision to civilian problems and discovered that the same technologies that had been developed to locate and destroy enemy vessels could be used to heal human bodies, improve manufacturing quality, and enhance safety in countless other contexts. The transformation was neither automatic nor inevitable. It required sustained institutional commitment, systematic investment in research and development, and most critically, the moral wisdom to apply technological capability for constructive rather than destructive purposes. The same acoustic principles that enabled torpedo guidance could enable medical diagnosis, but only if societies chose to emphasize civilian applications over military ones, healing over destruction, prosperity over conquest. Yoshida's 2.3-degree error, which seemed so catastrophically significant in November 1944, has been absorbed into a larger narrative of technological progress and international cooperation that extends far beyond its immediate military consequences. His mathematical mistake, born from outdated charts and inadequate equipment, contributed to a chain of events that eventually helped transform Japan from military defeat to economic prosperity, from imperial ambition to peaceful innovation, from technological dependence to global leadership in multiple fields of electronic engineering. The convoy he was trying to navigate safely to port was destroyed, its cargo lost, its crew scattered across the dark waters of the Philippine Sea. But the technological lessons learned from that destruction proved far more valuable than any material goods the ships might have carried. The acoustic sensors that enabled the convoy's destruction became the foundation for industries that employed millions of people, technologies that improved billions of lives, and scientific developments that expanded human understanding of natural phenomena in ways that would have been unimaginable to naval officers fighting in 1944. The sensor revolution that emerged from Japan's wartime defeat demonstrates that technological competition is never truly concluded, that today's decisive advantage becomes tomorrow's baseline expectation, and that the most significant innovations often emerge from the systematic study of past failures rather than the celebration of past successes. Engineering precision and intellectual humility, combined with institutional support for long-term research, can transform even catastrophic defeat into technological opportunity that benefits not merely the former losers but humanity as a whole. The historical irony is profound and instructive. American technological superiority in 1944 was so complete that it created the conditions for its own eventual displacement. By demonstrating the possibilities of acoustic sensor technology so convincingly, American naval forces provided their former enemies with a clear understanding of what was technically possible and economically valuable. Japanese engineers studying captured American equipment were not merely reverse engineering foreign devices, they were learning to think systematically about technological innovation as a continuous process, rather than a series of isolated achievements. In the end, the story of Tama-02 transcends its immediate historical context to become a meditation on the relationship between technological capability and human wisdom. The convoy's destruction was a local tactical event, significant primarily for the sailors who died and the strategic materials that were lost, but the technological principles demonstrated during that brief engagement proved to have universal applicability, touching virtually every aspect of modern life through applications that extend far beyond military contexts. The revolution initiated by Japan's systematic study of American acoustic technology continues today, as sensors become increasingly sophisticated and find applications in environments that would have been unimaginable to the engineers who first studied captured sonar equipment in the ruins of post-war Japan. From the depths of the Philippine Sea to the laboratories of Silicon Valley, from medical clinics in rural villages to manufacturing plants in emerging economies, the trajectory remains consistent. Technological competition drives innovation, defeat teaches humility, and systematic learning transforms temporary setbacks into permanent advantages. Lieutenant Commander Yoshida's navigation error of 2.3 degrees ultimately contributed to technological advances that have touched virtually every aspect of modern life, from the smartphone that tracks your location, to the medical equipment that monitors your health, from the automobile that helps you avoid accidents, to the manufacturing systems that produce the goods you use daily. The price paid, measured in ships destroyed and lives lost, was enormous and irreversible, a debt that can never be fully calculated or adequately honored. But the lessons learned, applied with engineering precision and institutional patience, proved that even the most devastating military failures can be transformed into foundations for future prosperity if approached with sufficient intellectual humility and moral commitment. The acoustic sensors that destroyed a Japanese convoy in 1944 became the technological foundation for industries that create civilian prosperity, medical devices that save lives, and scientific instruments that expand human knowledge. This is the true weight of consequence, not just the immediate destruction that follows from technological inadequacy, but the longer arc of learning, adaptation, and eventual transcendence that emerges from honest recognition of failure, combined with systematic effort to understand and improve upon superior techniques. The sensor revolution that began with Japan's defeat in the Pacific continues to reshape our world, one acoustic wave at a time, with mechanical precision and human ingenuity working together to transform sound into knowledge, signal into understanding, and defeat into progress. The mathematics are eternal, the applications evolve, the potential remains unlimited for those with sufficient wisdom to learn from their failures and sufficient dedication to apply that learning for the benefit of humanity rather than its destruction. In the end, Yoshida's small error became part of a larger story about the power of systematic learning to transform technological defeat into civilian prosperity, a story that continues to unfold with each new application of acoustic sensing technology, each new device that sees clearly through darkness, each new medical technique that heals rather than harms. The waves still propagate, the signals still carry meaning, the revolution continues,